Hi, my name is Maggie Zurawski. In print, I'm Magdalena Zurawski. This is our panel on translation, a roundtable. So the format we've decided on is that each of us will speak 3 to 5 minutes on our issues around translation and our current projects. And then we'd like to open it up to conversation. But before we do that, I'm going to ask everyone on the panel just to briefly introduce themselves in 2 or 3 sentences. So I'm Maggie Zurawski. I am a poet. I have a few books out in the world, and I teach at the University of Georgia in the creative writing program.
Hello, I'm Gil-Montero. I'm a poet and translator from Spanish. I'm also an editor of Eulalia Books, which is a small translation press, and I teach at St. Vincent College in Latrobe, PA.
Hi, my name is Hannah V. Warren. I just got done with the PhD at the University of Georgia, and I translate German poetry that traditionally is very, very weird, and so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I have a book out.
Hi there, my name is Gunnar. I am Norwegian. I have been translating from English and Bulgarian, and I have translated C.A. Conrad, Alice Notley, Sharon Olds, Terence Hayes, and also I worked a lot in teams translating from languages which I don't really master, like Lithuanian, Polish, and Russian. So my specialization is untranslatable poetry.
Hi, I'm Lau Cesarco Eglin. I'm a poet and a translator from Spanish, Portuguese, Portuñol, and Galician. And I'm also the publisher at Belize Books. And I teach creative writing at the University of Houston downtown.
Hi, I'm Gabriel Gudding, and I'm a poet. I teach at Illinois State University, and I've been translating Gunnar's work. And this is Gunnar's debut for American English. It's from his wonderful book, Ben Me Allah, and I'll be talking about that and a co-translation project that Gunnar and I have been working on. Sure, I don't want to, but I will. So, about 5 years ago, I wrote to Johannes Gerritsen, hey, do you know any Norwegian poets who might want to help me translate their work? Because I did not know Norwegian very well at all. I'm from a Norwegian-speaking part of Minnesota. My family watched the language die out, and so he gave me Gunnar's email and said he's very generous, and it turned out to be the case. He is very generous. Essentially, Gunnar helped me learn Norwegian. Gunnar taught me Norwegian, so it was like learning Italian from Dante or something. I mean, Gunnar is an extremely well-known poet in Scandinavia. There was a conference on his work in Sundsvall, Sweden in August of 2022, and I was fortunate enough to attend, and it was there that I got to see some things that I had intuited about Gunnar's work, that it's widely read, that people think of it as very weird and difficult, and I began to get a sense of that then. And so as I was translating this book, I had no idea what I was getting into. I did not understand that this book is full of a great deal of complexity and lexical density that was just beyond me. I would read, Norwegian grammars, I would watch Norwegian television shows and whatnot, but it was of no avail, it was of no help really in some ways. And it was slowly over the course of several dozens of hours working with Gunnar that I began to understand this book that became Friends with Everyone, that was just published by Action Books. Hey, John. And it was only then after Gunnar introduced me to a fellow poet who was also writing in Norwegian named Pedro Carmona Alvarez, when I began translating Pedro's work, I realized just how unusual Gunnar's and how complex Gunnar's Norwegian is. And it was only then that I began to go, oh my goodness, so I really got to go through these poems and make sure that they're defamiliarized and as odd as they are in Norwegian. And Gunnar was an amazing help, a great help. Extremely, as he says, or as one of the speakers in this remarkable book that is full of disembodied speech, is very good with words. He will not say that. Some of the people in his book say that, but so he was able to help me not only with the Norwegian, but with the English. Some of the best lines in this book are in English, are Gunnar's lines. Yeah, and so my 3 minutes are up, and I'll hand it over to Gunnar.
Thank you, Gabe, for that generous introduction. What I would like to talk a little bit about is how translation is, you can't avoid cooperating with people, and you can't avoid to listen. And you have to open up and become a vessel for whatever is there in the original. And the way I started being a translator was through teamwork. That's because I didn't know Lithuanian, I didn't know Russian, so I was dependent upon the person that knew Lithuanian. And then I was dependent upon the editor and the expert that had translated several other books before. And then in this process I learned how to not just translate, because it's not just a question of words that has to be translated from one language to the other. You have to grasp the context, and you also have to grasp the suppleness and the feel of it. And you don't really get there just by knowing the language. You have to dip into different aspects of the social character of language. And that's when meeting people becomes essential for translating. So this is why I would like to emphasize the importance of translating live poets before you start translating dead poets. Both aspects of translating are of course very important, but learning to translate live poets is good, because then you can call them or write to them, and you can present yourself, and you always start by presenting yourself as the person who don't know anything, which is a good thing in itself. And then from there you start developing an understanding of the person behind the poem, and then you start tapping into the traditions around that particular person and how they perceive their own language and their own context. And from there you start to build a space from where you can choose the right words, the right phrases, and the right way of moving, the right dance steps, so to say. So the poet that was most helpful in this process for me was the Russian speaking but Chuvash language poet Gennady Aigi. I'm not sure if any one of you are familiar with him. He was he came from Chuvashia and he wrote in Russian. So when I started reading his stuff, I thought of him as a Russian avant-gardist. But he turned out to be a Chuvash national poet, also hiding behind the Russian avant-garde facade. I didn't know anything about that. And then in the process he left this world, and we had to acquaint ourselves with his sister instead, so that we could have a source of information, and she took us on a ride to the different places he used to write about. So things we thought that were mere metaphor, like the god's bonfire turned out to be a field. And after visiting the field bearing the name of God's bonfire, seeing that field at sunrise, sort of the whole project landed. because there was a place, a so-called a crossroads from where you could find all directions. So, yeah, cooperation, meeting people, listening in, exploring. That's translation for me. And with this, I would like to give the mic. Wow.
Thank you. It's funny because I started by translating somebody that was dead, Yudayoshi, the Brazilian author, and now I'm translating. And then I moved to translating people that are living. So what I want to talk about is, so lately I've been translating from the Galician, which is a minoritized language. So I always think of what my positionality is as a translator. Who am I translating? What kind of language am I translating into what? And who are going to be the readers? So I'm from Uruguay. English is not my first language. Galician is not my first language, and yet I'm translating. And I also understand that Galician is a minoritized language within Spain, right? It's not that I particularly chose to translate from that language and not from Spanish, for example. And what does it mean that it's being translated into English first? This book, Klaus and the Scorpion, that came out in 2022 with co-impress by Lara do Paso Ruibal. What does it mean that it's translated into English first and not into Spanish first, which is what usually happens within Spain, right? And minoritized languages as Euskera and Galician and Catalan, etc. And I came to understand quite a few things, and which is, for me, translation is moving from and trying to run away from mono, one, into plural, right? So from one culture, right? And I'm translating into English because I live in the U.S. If I had been living in Uruguay, I would have translated this into Spanish. If I had been living in Brazil, I would have done it into Portuguese. That's why I'm using English. So I'm with translation, I'm leaving one culture, this idea of a monolith culture, that it's the only culture that works as a default. It's challenging hegemonic ideas and homogeneity. Translation also moves away from, moves into a conversation, right? Several conversations. My conversation with Lara do Paso Ruibal, or I'm also now just finished translating Sardine by Miriam Reyes. It's going to come out in 2026 with Ugly Duckling, and again, so I'm having these conversations with these poets, and poetry usually comes when it's published bilingually, so there's a conversation, right, on FOSS in general. There's a conversation between the poem in Galician and my translation into English. So again, this is like two moving away from just one, and also understanding how translation is a conversation in that we are porous to listening to the other. We are porous to exchange, and in that exchange, change. But also moving away from this ideal translator. Who is the ideal translator of these books that I've been translating? Is it somebody into English? Is it somebody who was born and raised in the US? Is it somebody who has ties to Galicia? Which I do, but in a different way than expected. And again, this ideal translator is this notion of an ideal translator is already thinking of one, and that's not the case. I'm one translator, and I'm a responsible one, right? But it doesn't. mean that if I translated these books that nobody else can translate these authors? There should be ongoing conversations. Yeah, and the last thing that I want to say about this is that moving away from one, as in reading Lara do Paso Rival's work from the Galician does not mean that you're reading Galicia. It does not mean that you become an expert in Galicia or that the book is a representation of Galicia, right? Poetry is about questioning, much in the same way as translation is. And also the fact that I translate from Galician doesn't make me an ambassador, right? So again, I think for me, translating is a movement away from the individuality, a movement against patriarchal, capitalist ways of thinking of one and hierarchy and only very limited possibilities. And translation is the opposite. It's inquiry, it's reading, it's rereading, it's listening deeply. It's having these conversations and being willing to learn from and change the text, the original text. I hate to call it that, but whatever. The text that you're translating, it changes with your version on the other side, and your version changes. You change the language. I'm changing English with these translations, yeah, that's my spiel.
I'm really glad you've already chatted a little bit about how translation works as this anti-monolith. That's a lot of what my poet is doing. Her name is Alexandra Bernhardt, and she's an awesome German-Austrian poet who lives in Vienna right now. She's a living poet, and so we're continuously conversing back and forth. Her English is a tiny bit worse than my German, and so we're both just having a great time via email, and I love this continuous exchange we're having because she is speaking to how Europe does not exist as a monolith, and she's talking continuously about the brokenness of borders, how Europe has consistently changed its borders, how it's really hard to say what the German identity is, and she struggles a lot with trying to determine who she is as a German-born citizen in the 2000s. And so she does a lot of reckoning with her own historical background throughout a very weird formulation of broken poetry that has super difficult German grammar. And if you know anything about German, you know they really, really enjoy their grammatical system. And she pushes against that really hard, which is incredibly difficult for translation when you're trying to put that together. One of my favorite things about Bernhardt's poetry is that she's consistently bringing in things like a little snippet of Polish every now and then, maybe a little bit of Russian. Sometimes she has a little snip of Norwegian. But this is also just pushing against those boundaries of what language means across borders. Half of her writing is in Mittelhochdeutsch, Middle High German. And so throughout my translation process, I've done this really fun thing where I translate Middle High German to English, back to Middle English, and it's the exact same word. And so that's been a really cute transformational process for me as I have made my German better through learning language through the worst possible way of learning German. But it's been phenomenal. And one thing that I have been thinking a lot about is that I have a tendency to try to normalize her poetry when I put it into English because it doesn't make sense to me in German. But that's her entire point. And so one thing that I'm working on right now is mystifying her poetry again on the English side. And so I've been thinking about my own poetic practice, how my poetry is really weird and grotesque, and it also pushes against linguistic barriers. And I realized that I didn't quite understand why I wasn't letting her poetry do that as well. So if I can skip grammar, why can't I let her skip grammar? And so I've been pushing some of my own practices onto her poetry, and it all of a sudden got way more joyful and way weirder. And it's going back to her intentions of saying that language is wibbly wobbly, language translates in odd ways in her poems, and they can do that inside my English versions as well. I did want to really quick tell y'all about one of the poems that I've been translating. In German, it's idiosynkratische Botanik. In English, it's idiosyncratic botany. Under the arched alder, take me in my likeness. Under the curved elm, simply surrender me. Under the cocooning poplar, wail my heart seed forth. But above the seed-sated earth, catch me, the sowing seed smoke. German, and yeah, she's awesome. German shoves together words a lot, and they often use the exact same ending with a different prefix, and it changes the word entirely. So in her poem, she repeats the word seed continuously, and she does that throughout her entire book, but it never means the same thing. And putting that into English by saying that seed is in the original, but it doesn't mean seed anymore, is nearly impossible. And so I started using the word seed in the weirdest ways. So she says Saatsamen, and I made that seed-sated. That's not what it means. Sazamen does not mean sowing seed, but it's the closest thing that we can get in this translation while maintaining the weird. And that's something that I would love to talk about with other people on this panel, is how do we maintain the weird? Do we translate it directly, or do we do something that looks like refraction? Thanks.
Wow, it's so great to be a part of this conversation. I feel like all the weirdo translators are uniting here. It's like, this is the right company. So many things that everyone has said resonate with me. I translate, I've been translating Maria Negroni. She's an Argentinian writer, living writer, since 2008. I've translated 7 of her books so far, and I'm working on a lyric novel right now. I think that working on somebody's work for so long has allowed me to really, go through all of the winding ins and outs of the relational aspect of translation. So much is collaboration, so much is, it's interpersonal as well as like interpoetic. There are moments of resistance, there are moments of synergy. Maria Negroni's work is, in many ways, it grapples with tradition and convention and with language too. There's a certain restlessness inside the Argentinian literary tradition, so she's sort of taken up the project of a pretty famous essay by Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian poet and tradition, and sort of taken up the problem of thinking about what it means to be an Argentinian writer. So many of her books are sort of, adaptations, or they are, reading and responding to other texts. One book was that I translated first of hers was a response to Bomarzo, which was an opera, but also a book by Manuel Mujica Lainez, a novel about Duke Orsini in the mouth of hell in Italy. It's called Mouth of Hell. She like takes up some of her forebears and sort of reworks some sort of quintessentially Argentinian writing. She has a book, Islandia, that's a response to Borges and his Iceland. Meanwhile, she's very interested in pushing against the confines of genre, of language, of her language, a lot of non-normative syntax, a lot of invented words, a lot of sort of atypical structures. One of the things that has allowed me to continue working with her work for so long is that she's very stylistically restless. She says that stylistic change is a hallmark of obsessiveness. And I think I've experienced, she's written very minimalist lyrics, she's written books of prose poetry, she's written novels that are like weird fugues, she's written a variety of like mishmashes of reading and writing. Her work touches on politics, but it's also very much about art. She was an activist during the dictatorship, and then she lived in the United States for a long time, and then went back to Argentina in the last 10 years. It's been a deepening. The obsessiveness of my translating of her work has allowed me to really notice a lot of repetition and variation. It's allowed me to really understand another poet's whole work very deeply, and that has been, you know, a defining experience for me as a translator and as a writer. It's challenged my whole understanding of modes and genres and the Spanish language, and like we were saying, very much what I have to do with English. Her work is very strange, and so I'm often struggling to not normalize it or domesticate it, but let it be weird. Of course, nothing is ever weird in the same way. So, you know, sometimes Maria will be like, oh no, but that's a different part of speech there. And I'm like, I know, but you know, here, it can't really do that, so I'm gonna do another thing. You know, oftentimes, you know, two languages aren't weird in the same ways always, so as you were detailing. So yeah, I think that it is fascinating. I've translated other writers too, but it's fascinating to me just hearing everybody thinking about, you know, or just for the occasion of this panel, thinking about how long I've translated her work and how that has, you know, every translation project has informed the one before, and how, you know, really defining it's been for me as a translator to delve into one writer's work in that way.
So I'm definitely the least experienced person on this panel, and so I'm grateful to be included in this company so I can steal tricks from you. But I wanted to just tell a story, and I did that by writing it out, otherwise I might babble too long. So I recently returned to translation after 30 years because of a new book project, one related to my family. I grew up in a bilingual Polish household in New Jersey, and until the pandemic, I had been functionally illiterate in Polish. The global health crisis gave me the time to take Polish lessons online as preparation for my next writing project. I wanted to go to Poland and do archival research to see how much I could discover about my family's time there during World War II. Unbeknownst to my parents, I grew up being told war stories by traumatized old people when no one else was looking. It made me obsessed with the war as if it somehow was the defining event of my American life. One day, my Polish teacher, Aga, knowing my interests in American poetry, introduced me to the poet Miron Białoszewski, who I loved immediately. Białoszewski also wrote prose, and I became obsessed with his most famous prose work, Memoir of the Warsaw Uprising. The memoir chronicles Białoszewski's own movements through the city with his family and friends during the 6 weeks of fighting that led to the Nazis' leveling of the city. Białoszewski was about 20 years old during the uprising and a civilian, not a member of the Polish underground army. His book was the first to give the civilian perspective. From the memoir, you learn what it's like to live in a city as it is being bombed to rubble. What happens in the cellars where thousands are hiding, sleeping, eating, trying to find food, water, trying not to die. At first, I loved the text because it allowed me to imagine what my grandmother lived through as a 19-year-old. But when I landed in Warsaw in October of 2023 on a Fulbright to research my writing project, I realized that I already knew the city, that the memoir had given me a way to know the city. The church 2 streets over from my apartment was where Białoszewski got soup from some nuns one day. The manhole where Białoszewski enters the sewers with thousands of others as the old city falls to the Nazis was right around the corner from our apartment, etc., etc. The list goes on and on and on. It felt uncanny. By the end of my stay, I learned that my great-grandfather had been taken by the Germans during the uprising, only to die of starvation as the Nazis were evacuating the concentration camp he was in. When I learned that his death was a result of the uprising, I felt like Białoszewski's memoir was also in some small way my story too. I also read Białoszewski's other less dramatic prose, works which document his daily life in the 1970s and early 80s. I'm obsessed with him. I only read Białoszewski for like 2 years, except for stuff I had to teach. So, I know Warsaw through them, and they have everything that I love about the Polish language in them. The everyday speech of regular people, the music, the humor and its rhythms, and the ridiculousness of daily life in a city during the Soviet era. It's one of these mundane prose works that I'm translating now, Zawał, Heart Attack in English. It documents Białoszewski's first heart attack. He had several, and his convalescence. I love the way old Polish men in a communist hospital in the 1970s talk to one another. They are concerned with pig's feet and aspic and their own bowel movements. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I'm translating out of Polish because I love Białoszewski, because his work has allowed me to be Polish in a way that also feels like being me, that the part of me that's a poet, a writer. And as a translator, I feel like my main impetus is an emotional one, which maybe is a problem. I want you to read my translations of Białoszewski one day and love him and love Warsaw as much as I do. I'm wondering how different this makes me from the other translators here. So, maybe we can, I don't know, should we talk amongst ourselves, open, either way?
I just want to say that there was a graduate student at Illinois State University named Kasia Jakubiak, who now lives in Poland, and she and I co-translated some of Białoszewski's first book, and yeah, that's a colleague of hers up at the University of Chicago said, "Oh, you're translating that? You know, okay." So that's basically said it was untranslatable and probably wouldn't be good for her career, whatever. But she kept going, and yeah, that poet is whack. I like how he starts like a sentence or a phrase and just stops mid-word.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of like what Ron Padgett will do when he'll interject something in the middle of, you know, small, like in the middle of, yeah.
It's interesting because he's known as like a linguistic poet. He didn't write the memoir until started writing it in the 60s, and it was translated in the early 70s. But his first book came out, Poetry, in 1956, and it was only because of the Stalinist thaw, because he was so innovative linguistically, and you know, he was writing about how beautiful the ceramic coal oven in his apartment was. It had nothing to do with workers or anything. So he's very peculiar, and he's very difficult in terms of, he plays with the morphology of Polish, which you can't do. And I thought to myself, I'm never touching his poems. But I did like his prose. I became obsessed with the prose because it was something about a world I wanted to have access to, a social world. And he saw his prose works, which don't fall into normal genre categories. Like sometimes he calls them zapiski, which are just like notes. They're very diaristic. I don't know, like apparently he would ride the trams at night and then get off a tram and just write down the conversation he overheard. So at some point he said that he didn't see his poetry and prose as different projects, but that the prose explored the social aspects of Polish rather than just the innate morphological potential in that. So. Any questions?
I'm very curious as to how or if translation has changed the way you think about your target language. Like if you're translating into English, do you now think about English differently, its shortcomings or future possibilities? What about other languages as well? Like, does translating English into Norwegian change the way you think about the Norwegian language?
My own language has started absolutely exploding. And so I have never been a poet who follows very specific guidelines. I cannot write a foreign poem to save my life. I'm terrible at it. But it's gotten even weirder because I have seen the way that German poetry takes language and just shifts it around inside a sentence, and it's still completely fine. And so taking that German poetic license to just go wherever you want to on the page, I knew existed for other poets, but I never put it into my practice. And so I see really weird language formations, like shoving 8 words together at one time, popping up in my poetry now in ways that I never expected, and repetitions that I never expected either. Alexandra Bernhardt's Little Seeds planted inside me. And so now I'm writing the word seed all the time and I have to stop myself. And so it's been really lovely just to give myself permission to be even weirder in different ways than I already am.
this is a little bit of what I was talking about, right? Allowing this exchange and not being so fixed in the purity of a language, right? It doesn't exist. A language is alive, and the richer it is, if it allows for these influences. I find that yes, all my languages have changed every time I translate from whatever language, right? So translating from the Galician, even my Spanish has changed, my Portuguese has changed, the way I inhabit English has changed. But I think that it allows us to do a lot of things, not just in our own writing, but in the way that we think about a translation, right? Because certainly, for example, Galician is a Romance language, and as such, it has, for example, reflexives, right? So I do something to myself, right? I brush my hair, English does not. And you could say, so what? But in a book like this one, where it's talking about this violent world, and it's like a whirlwind, and it wants to trap you, so there's a lot of repetition, and you can't get out. It's like, oh my God. So this repetition and this mirrors appear, and if a reflexive verb appears, I have to pay attention. It's not just a reflexive verb, it's a verb that is embodying the meaning of, or this habitat that is being created. So I have to recreate that. And how do you do it? By being flexible. I did it by adding extra lines and having the repetition come like that, for example. But it's a translation allows us to do that, to be creative, to be subvertive, to challenge and to rethink. And I know that the word weird has been thrown around a lot, but I want to step away from romanticizing weird, because weird is the opposite of normalization. And again, we are still within a binary, and I think that it's not weird, it's just not you. So it's not weird, it's a different culture, or it's a different person thinking in a different way. So for me, the exercise is, I'm just gonna shut up and be quiet and pay attention and just allow myself to be amazed, and in turn that will change me, I think.
Yeah, I think that there's something just inherent in the process, in the ritual of sitting down and navigating these in-between spaces between languages, that my experience is that I feel a little bit estranged from English, from like my native English. I feel like it's sort of, I have a looser grasp of it. And what it does for me is it lets me see it as, I have less possessiveness over it. I'm much more willing to let the language do things that I wouldn't normally do. And I think in my writing, I've noticed that I'm much more open to playing with error and like hearing homonyms and replacing the words with the homonyms and just letting things be slippery, because I don't feel like I have this tight possessive grasp over English when I'm sitting in the translation space on the daily. So I think that is, I think of it in terms of like, how it sort of nudges me outside. It makes me see English as somewhat more alien. I'm trying to, the first draft of a translation, I'll usually be very, very close to the Spanish, and English will look really bad, look really weird. And then like learning to kind of enjoy that experience and see it as a site of possibility has been really, really fruitful for me in writing in English.
Questions?
I have a question. Yeah, I translate from Serbian. I'm a Serb American. And I'm really interested in, we're talking about interacting with a living poet. And I've had all kinds of interactions with living poets. Sometimes their English is really good, sometimes hardly anything, and then sometimes it's kind of in between. So very interesting, what happens there. And, and I'm interested in wordplay and what happens with wordplay in the original language and how it's so difficult to translate them and to be aware that it's wordplay, if you yourself can't speak the language so well. And then I wanted to know what you do. What do you do when you're struggling? I spend days sometimes trying to come up with a word or trying to translate, and dictionaries can be useful, but Google Translator is just really terrible. Sometimes in Serbian there are dictionaries, online dictionaries, and perhaps you have that in these other languages that you can use sometimes that only people from that language might know, and it's very useful. And sorry, just so many questions. And then translating cultural things, that's the hardest. So I guess you make something new completely, as Pound would say, make it new. And do something completely different in another language, or as you said, you translate, if it's one product that you don't have in the States, you translate with a product that's similar in this country. Sorry. Gunnar, do you want this?
That's like a super difficult question.
Sorry.
But and it's like striking into open air to talk about this. But when it comes to the actual wordplay, the one poet I have translated from Russian, which is called, he is called Velimir Chlebnikov, and he is considered to be extremely difficult. And he uses wordplay as a way of thinking. So he extracts meaning from wordplay and makes the poems take completely unexpected directions. And for example, the similarity between miach and mech. Miach is a ball, and mech is a weapon, a sword or a blade. And the general idea here is that the ball is something you would play with. It's soft and it's for children, and the blade or the sword is dangerous. And how do you recreate that? You have to decide, is the semantic value of the words ball or sword, is the meaning the most meaningful thing here, or is the actual playing with the words the most meaningful thing? So the most, and then it depends how many people have translated this poetry before you. If nobody has done that before you, you feel a certain responsibility to show how the poet is thinking. So then you go for the more pedagogic variation. Then you put a footnote, or you actually implement the original words into the translation, so that the miach, mech similarity and opposition comes through literally. Or you can choose to transpose that weirdness into something in your own mother tongue. And then it depends, how is the tradition for translating such stuff into the mother tongue? Is that acceptable? Like Norwegian, for example, is a very, very small language, like 5 million people speak it, and it's constantly being assailed by loan words from English, loan words from Swedish, so it's hanging by a thread. So it's already so weird and so brittle and so soft. So screwing it up further would actually make people react negatively. So you need to, so I usually make 2 variations, and then I sort of present one variation as the literal translation and the other one as the reenactment or the restaging of the poem's situation. And that is that's a far weirder direction, but it somehow preserves the spirit of the whole endeavor in a better way.
So you published both versions?
Yes, but you can't do that in one volume because you're supposed to be serious and translation is supposed to be reliable business, right? So the other version, the weirder one, comes out in a different context, comes out in a journal, or 10 years after, when you reprint the thing, you realize that the reenactment, the weirder one, is actually the one that you should have presented from the start. So I'm testing out the limits here. What's okay? I'm not sure. Yeah.
I just want to mention an example of a text that does come out with different translations and possibilities, and it's yes, I published it, but it's the Uplands, and it's called the Uplands, and it's by the Galician poet Ushio Novoneira. He was like an eco-poet before eco-poetry was even a thing, and Erin Mode translated him. And when you open that book, you see the seams, right? Which is what people try to hide, right? No, you shouldn't even realize that you're reading a translation. And Erin, which I find, I align with this kind of translation. On the contrary, she says, yes, this is a translation, look. And you see the process, and on the page, you will see the poem in Galician, and you will see different versions and how she's been thinking. So translation is so wide because translation is reading, and I read this book and I read one thing, and then you can read it and have a different interpretation. And not that it's free for all, but different readers, and you will catch different things and focus on different things. So I think there are a lot of possibilities, and that should be freeing instead of, did I get it right, or am I doing it? So I think translation is a practice of letting go, right?
Oh, we have time? Okay. It helps. I was going to say it helps when the person you're translating is also a translator. So when I present Gunnar with the issues in English that he's usually aware of, but there, I see complications there, he will say just, essentially defamiliarize it in some way such that it matches this particular tone. So years ago, I was translating a Cuban expatriate poet from Spanish, obviously, Carlos Aguilera. He lives in Germany. And I was asking him about all the puns in this chapbook I translated. And like, for instance, the word testiculo. So he'll break the word in half such that it's culo, which is ass. And so I was like, I really don't want to recapitulate all these things awkwardly. And he just writes back and says, just make it as lewd as possible. And I'm like, that I can do. I can do that. So it really helps. And Gunnar was, he's just like, just defamiliarize it in a way that such that it answers this particular tone or something.
Are there any other questions? We should wrap up. Okay, so thank you so much.
Thank you.